and participants Silvia Federici and Alice Markham-Cantor.
Thank you for such a very interesting film. Worked in documentary for a while and haven't seen anything on witches or, just the themes were really were powerful and moving. So thank you for that. Can you talk about how you came to the subject?
Yes, well, I came to the subject, the first time actually this project became an idea was after reading Silvia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, and that was around 2010, a few years after she actually wrote it, but that was a moment in which I was like reading a lot, trying to understand what was happening in the world, what was happening to me, and when I read the book, it was really revealing for me. It was like, wow. On the one hand, I was like really understanding many of the things that were happening back in the world, were happening to me, that I just had a baby and I was trying to understand what motherhood was about. But also I was really pissed off, like how come this episode in women's history is not taught in schools, high schools, it's in every headline. We should know, it's totally invisible. It's like, how come? So I promised myself that I had to do a film about it. I didn't know how or when, and I had to wait for a little while because it was not that easy. But then in 2018, I was in Madrid, living in Madrid, and Silvia came to Madrid to present the international campaign for the memory of the witches, of the women persecuted for witchcraft. And then I had the chance to speak with her, and I said, like, Silvia, I want to make a film about inspiring Caliban of the Witch. I don't know how yet, and I was thinking of doing something more experimental about women memory. But then, just a few months after the presentation of the campaign, there was the first symposium on witch hunts took place in Pamplona, the north of Spain. Silvia was there, and Alice was there. She was one of the persons, of the people doing a lecture there. That symposium was really important because it was the very first one in which we gathered like more than 200 women, many of them experts and academics, mostly from Spain, talking about this topic. I've been reading for years about it, but it's really not, it's difficult to actually find readings and archival materials, etc. about it. So it was really interesting. And then when I listened to Alice, and I was like, wow, this is the story I was looking for, because then I have a great story, a great character, and also for me, she embodies what actually the campaign was meant for. It was claiming to become, to like all women trying to dive into archives, to investigate, to do research on the topic, to rewrite history. And that was she was doing. She was doing like even researching her own family, but becoming a storyteller of something more global, something a really global history of women. So I just approached her in that moment and said, like, Alice, let's do a short little film about you. And then Belén Marco came on board. She's one of the also members of the campaign, and we decided to go to Salem. Soon after that, I had the chance to pitch the project to Ruth Somalo, who is here too. And she said, hey, yes, let's go. We had no funding, anything, just some equipment and a lot of ideas. But we decided to go to Salem, and that's how we started. Silvia opened her house to us. And then when we got the footage, we realized that it wasn't for a short film, that we needed to make a little bit longer. And that was kind of the beginning of the project. And now you see the result.
I thought one of the more, compelling but not totally surprising aspects was this link between witchcraft and capitalism. It always goes back to money, right? Silvia, you've written extensively about that. Can you share a little bit more on that link?
Yeah, where to start, Well, it's, first of all, what struck me when I began to read about the history of the witch hunts was the chronology, because the witch hunts, the great witch hunts in Europe, and that soon were also exported to the countries, the regions that Europe was colonizing, was simultaneous with really the development of capitalism across the world, particularly in Europe, but also soon in the Americas, was contemporary with the beginning of the slave trade, with the big expulsion of the peasantry in Europe from the land, which was really the beginning of land privatization, the beginning of a land market, and the foundation for the development of wage work. So for me, it was clear that there was a connection there. And obviously, I found many connections because the change, the development of capitalist society basically transformed every aspect of life. People's relationship to their bodies, to nature, to animals, to the concept of what is wealth. And so in the case of women, it became obvious that witch hunt was a turning point, and a major role in the disciplining of women, and in the creating the kind of woman that would be, functional to the new forms of organizational work. So that with the development of capitalism, you have a whole devaluation of reproductive activity, you have a new forms of patriarchal domination, and the creation of a woman who is supposed to be completely subjective, submissive, and the witch hunts were very fundamental. As with every major historical development, you can never really prove, it's not that you can have one case, or they can actually prove that connection. But obviously, the context is very clear. Yeah.
And Alice, very, very personal story for you, and also, quite a journey. What were you most surprised about finding out?
It's a good question. There were a lot of surprises along the way. I would say a really big one was when my aunt was doing some genealogy research, and I mentioned this briefly in the film, but figured out, she brought this huge genealogy map that she'd created and wanted to show me, and I was looking at the names and realized that Martha was on there, and then I also recognized someone else who was actually the jailer in Salem town who kept the prisoners. He was the guy who ran the jail, and who would have been Martha's jailer, and then, a couple generations down the line, their kids got married. So that was, that took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting that, but, it's not a very big colony, first of all, but I think it really sort of went to show how much this was, people moved away after the trials. A lot of people got out of Massachusetts who had been affected and went to Connecticut or Rhode Island or somewhere else nearby, and so it was sort of immediately erased as much as possible, and left this vacuum which could then be filled by other stories or that kind of occurrence. Yeah.
Well, I saw an early cut of this at Union Docs maybe a year or two ago, and I'm just really fascinated at how you've reshaped it. It's really great. But it's a really tricky thing to meld these three stories. You have reenactments, you have scholarship, you have a personal journey. Can you talk a little bit about your artistic vision?
Yes, well, we had a few challenges here when telling the story. The first one was how we could make the connection between the personal story and the global history that we wanted to talk about. Because we wanted to talk about violence today, but violence back there. So for us, one challenge was to create this connection between past, present, and between the personal story and the global history. And the most challenging thing was how we tell this without using the iconography that has been used for years and 100 years to create the idea of the witch. Because when we came to use, okay, we had to use visuals. But all the visuals we were finding were like Goya paintings, many paintings from the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. That was all part of the creation of the iconography that we wanted to actually put into question, we didn't want to use that. So the first choice, Ruth suggested like, well, maybe we can hire somebody or create our own materials. And then I just realized that I knew somebody living I live in a very small town in Madrid. That's the town that we see at the beginning, at the very end. And I had this friend, artist, Esther Musgo, that she, and I was like, well, maybe we need another layer. We have the layer personal, going from personal, that is Alice. We have Silvia, who is gonna help us to create the link to the present and to the global history. And then we need Esther to create this more symbolic, poetic layer that will help us create our own iconography. And then we started to work with Esther. It was very performatic, like meeting one there, and like what we're gonna do. We didn't know never what was gonna happen, but we were like filming. I was filming, and she will be playing with all the materials like earth. Like that was a lot of meaning. She tried to wrap all these ideas of the earth, nature, and all these elements that they were always connected with witchcraft and with women. So she started to create all these things, and we were shooting. So that was kind of like the third layer that helped us wrap the film and also create the film as a circle. Like we start in the land, we start like touching the land, and we end up touching the land and then flying the land. Also from the skyscrapers of New York, we end up back to the land, to the nature. So we try to create this moment of more metaphorical and poetic work, so we could help connect with the film in a more emotional way. Also, with this final uplifting end of seeing women fighting, because also at the one of the challenges were like, wow, this is kind of tough. It's not a very nice story. Like, we're talking about a feminicide. We're talking about hundreds and 100,000 women being killed. Women, people who were not convenient for the system. So it's not very uplifting, but we need to, the message at the end, it needs to be a little bit like encouraging, I don't know, not just depressing and then just want to kill myself. It's not the point. So we decided to create also this poetic moment in which Alice enters this room with these 3 screens, in which it was a visual connection between the past, present, by violence against women in the past and violence against women in the present. More subtle violence, that with this idea of the princess, of the right women, of all these models that we had to fit in. And of course, we needed that moment of women fighting and struggles, etc. So that was kind of like also one of the artistic decisions that we had, to have a more really performatic end, to help a little bit go from the facts to the emotional.
I like ending on the flying and the uplifting. And speaking of flying, I heard that some of the music was made with actual broomsticks.
Yes, like the scene in which we see Alice building the wall, is everything created with brooms, like sticks, sounds. Yeah, the composer Mauri, he's amazing, and he was like, I'm gonna use it, like do it in a very craft way, and he spent a long time creating the sounds and then connecting it. But it was for him, it was his way to add a different meaning to one of the symbols of the witch.
Are there any questions for any of our panelists here, filmmaker? Think.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering more about the campaign that you were discussing about reaching the history of the
question was about using the film as part of a campaign to.
The campaign that where they met.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. Where you guys met?
No, well, actually, we had the second symposium on the International Symposium on Witch Hunts 3 weeks ago in Madrid. And a special work in progress version of the film was shown there at the big auditorium in the National Museum of Reina Sofía, Madrid. And of course, most of the people who were there were part of the campaign, were part of the symposium. And yes, of course, that's the idea of that this film is used to, I mean, ideally it will have an educational component that will be used to educate people on the topic, because for many people it's just, they have no idea about this. And it's not easy sometimes to talk, of course, and not everyone, we will recommend everyone reading Caliban and the Witch, but for maybe teenagers it might be not that easy, but creating educational materials to maybe go with the reading, and maybe film could be used to do that, yes. Do you want to say something about the campaign, Silvia?
No, just that the movie has been very much part of the campaign, yes. And I don't know if you want, the campaign started in 2000, well, the first major encounter that we had was in 2019, but it had been gestating for a number of years, and it originated by a journey that we took, a number of us took across Spain to areas where there had been execution, trials and execution. And we were very, very upset to discover that the witch hunts had been turned into tourist attractions. And this is not unusual. It's in fact happening across Europe. And so you go to the streets, and there is the image, of course, the stereotype image of the witch with the broom, the satanic smile. We encounter emporiums at the border between France and Spain, where you can buy 30 euros, you can buy your doll, again the satanic face, and then you see the tourists going away with their children, carrying the doll, and so on. It's propagating this very, very vile image, right? Distorting image, of course, for who were these so-called witches, but also very, very patriarchal and very disparative of older women. And so we decided that's how the campaign originated. We came back to Madrid, and we basically had a big press conference calling all the feminist groups, and we said, basta, we have to do something. And that's how the campaign began. And as of now, there's really many collectives across Spain, and it's beginning also in other places, that are going to the archives, that are actually beginning to also write materials for the schools, and making the connection past and present, because there's obviously a continuity between the witch hunts of the past and today's surge in violence against women.
And I'll just also say that if you go to memoriabrujas.net, you can find out a lot of the info about the campaign and the various chapters.
I think we have time for one more question. There you go.
Silvia, at the time the Great Witch Hunts were happening, was there contemporaneous accounts of it? What was the explanation given, and was there any alternative explanations given? Was there anybody saying something different than whatever the dominant view was? And then Alice, why did people leave Salem? I didn't follow that afterwards. So 2 questions snuck in there.
No, at the time of the witch hunts, there was no dominant explanation. I mean, there were many different explanations. In the case, for instance, of Salem, one explanation that was given was that whole area was infested by the devil, because of King Philip's War, because of the presence of indigenous communities, And but in Europe, there were, interesting enough, some of the explanations that were given for the rise of witch hunting was that the colonization and conquest of part of the Americas, had displaced the devils there. This is what was one explanation by, a famous witch hunter, Pierre Lelanque, who was a French magistrate. He basically said, well, we have more witch hunting now and more cases of witchcraft, because with the conquest, the devils are leaving America, and they are now moving into Europe. No, but ultimately, this was described as a new type of heresy at first, a new type of crime, and there was no explanation given that would connect it to the social transformation that were taking place.
And to revisit, so people left Salem. People left Salem because they were either afraid or ashamed, or had somebody in their family had been killed. I go through a lot of like what Salem Village was hoping for with the trials, and they did not get it. Like, we don't talk about that in the film, but it's not like they then succeeded in, they get independence like 50 years later. It doesn't get them what they were trying to do, and instead the trials basically rip Salem Village in half. And for the next 15 years, they are dealing with this. And the minister dies, and a number of the ringleaders die or move away, and they're still grappling with this. And they have all these days of fasting where they're trying to reckon with it, and ask God for forgiveness for what they did in the trials. And this goes on for literally 15 years. Some of the afflicted girls later make apologies where they say, I'm sorry that I, accused everybody of witchcraft. I, in fact, was being misled by the devil. In the meantime, a lot of the people who had their families accused or who were accused but survived, they didn't stay. They didn't want to stay there. And so they sort of scattered, and I think that had a lot to do with the way that then the story was told pretty quickly after the trials. People started talking about Salem like it had been a bad thing, which is not like the trials in Europe. The witch hunts in Europe were, their reputation as a good thing in the eyes of the church lasted much longer. In Salem, within 2 years, the head ministers in Boston are like, ooh, we screwed up. Like, that was not good. So people leave because they realize that there's nothing there for them anymore.
Well, thank you all so much for your thoughts and your insights on that very, very interesting film.